What was your overall opinion of Breath of the Wild's combat, Zelda crew? Personally, to me, it was okay, but honestly, I think there's many improvements Nintendo could make in Tears of the Kingdom to make fighting enemies and just basic combat overall much better and more seamless. When The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was released in 2017, it greatly improved the combat system established in previous 3D Zelda games. The new system was far more dynamic, allowing for a much greater range of actions that made fighting enemies in Breath of the Wild an absolute joy to some. Now with the sequel on the horizon in the form of Tears of the Kingdom, it is worth considering, Zelda crew, just how such a system could be improved. Building on a well-established game mechanic is much more difficult than you might think, as one small change can completely throw off the combat system. Nonetheless, Tears of the Kingdom can make some improvements to Breath of the Wild's combat, and I think it'll make gameplay even more fun. And hey, Zelda crew, if you really enjoy the Zelda series, make sure you stick around until the very end of this video because I have additional Zelda content that I'm sure you're not going to want to miss and that you're going to find a ton of value in. So my first idea is allowing enemies to take fall damage. Now this scenario might be similar to you if you played Breath of the Wild. Link will sometimes manage to sneak up on enemies and knock them off a large structure or building, only for them to get back up like they didn't just fall several stories, right? It's pretty amusing. While enemies will die if dropped from a high enough distance, there really isn't any fall damage for enemies in Breath of the Wild. Tears of the Kingdom should definitely correct this, in my opinion. I mean, after all, if Link can take damage from falling from a great height, then why can't the enemies? Makes sense, I think. Doing so would also deepen the combat as it sort of incentivizes us to find ways to knock enemies off of high places. It's kind of another way to, make combat more interesting and more strategies that we can use. Another thing I think should happen in Tears of the Kingdom is give us more enemy variety. This is something that's very popular in the Zelda community, and I know I'm not alone here, but it is no secret, right, that Breath of the Wild was lacking in enemy variety compared to all the other entries in the Zelda series, right? I mean, most enemies took the form of some type of humanoid wielding a weapon. This did make sense as it sort of ensures that we can always scavenge weapons from fallen foes, but it did mean that a lot of combat encounters ended up seeming familiar or more predictable in a way. I really think that as a Zelda fan, this could be one of the areas that Tears of the Kingdom can improve. By having a greater variety of enemies that require different strategies to defeat, I think it would greatly vary the combat and it would make it super engaging. Can you imagine just, traveling across Tears of the Kingdom's map and you just run into a Dark Nut or a like or something like that from the previous Zelda games? I think that would be super dope. Another thing that I think that Tears of the Kingdom could do to improve the combat system is just to add more counters in the game. Here's what I mean. In Breath of the Wild, one of the most important moves that Link can perform is the Flurry Rush. Now, by dodging at just the right moment, it is possible to unleash a barrage of blows against an opponent. Super good strat for a lot of the enemies in Breath of the Wild. The problem is that it quickly becomes the only real solution to counter the tougher enemies, like the Lionel, for example. The Flurry Blow definitely loses its luster when you use it a lot of the time. Adding some additional counter moves, I don't think it would be a terrible idea. Such moves could potentially act as an alternative to a Flurry Rush. Perhaps they might trade off sheer damage for other things like knocking an opponent over or simply pushing them away. The big thing that comes to mind here is the hidden skills in Twilight Princess. They could sort of intertwine that in. I mean, those were just amazing. If you know, Zelda crew. I think one of the most common complaints against Breath of the Wild was the limited durability of its weapons, which caused them to constantly break. If you look at it from a design standpoint, implementing these was the right decision, sort of, depending on who you talk to, as it encouraged us to keep constantly looking for new weapons and equipment. Nonetheless, it could still be very annoying to have weapons break every 30 seconds, and it discouraged us from using the best equipment. At least it did for me. It would perhaps be too rash to suggest that the mechanic should be discarded altogether. I mean, I think there is a little bit of a balance or a happy medium there, but it would cut down on the annoyance if the overall durability of most weapons could be increased somehow. Alternatively, perhaps some weapons couldn't actually break, but would instead lose their sharpness and become less effective until they can be repaired. Another solution to this, I think, and I've talked about this in previous videos, is sort of have like a blacksmith station somewhere throughout the map. That way you can go there, you can upgrade your weapons, you can build different weapons, make them more durable. I think that would be pretty sweet. And by the way, I create Zelda videos here on this YouTube channel, so if you're enjoying the video so far, remember that it's dangerous to go alone, so take this moment to subscribe and join our ever-growing community of passionate Zelda fans, and of course to help towards the goal of 50,000 subscribers. I appreciate you so much. You are awesome. Another thing I would like to see improved on in Tears of the Kingdom as far as the combat is make the Sheikah Slate more involved if it ever comes back. I think one of the great things about the combat from Breath of the Wild is how it could be used in conjunction with the various abilities of the Sheikah Slate. Link could freeze enemies with stasis, use magnesis to throw metal items at them, or simply throw bombs. That being said, Zelda crew, there is definitely room for improvement. It would be great to see the combat applications for the Sheikah Slate flushed out even more, giving us even more options when fighting enemies. Perhaps runes could mimic the functionality of items like bomb chews, or maybe even the gust bellows from Skyward Sword. This next one is something that is small, yet I think it would be pretty cool, and that would be to make bombs way more powerful. Here's what I mean. I think it's always fun to see a group of enemies huddled so close together, and I think it would be a pretty cool thing to witness to just chuck a bomb into their midst and then send them like just flying everywhere. However, it was super disappointing to see how little damage bombs actually did in Breath of the Wild. I think this could be sort of fixed or remedied by setting off exploding red barrels, which did significantly more damage, but those are not always available, right? They're just not abundance across the map. While it is understandable that the developers didn't want to make bombs too powerful and devalue the combat that was in Breath of the Wild, to me it also didn't make much sense that a bomb to the face seemed to do less damage than being whacked with a big stick. Let me know what you think in the comments. Now this is the biggest one. This is the icing on the cake for me. I think it was always frustrating when Link broke his last weapon in Breath of the Wild. Again, I don't think I'm alone there. Doing so meant that we, the player, were rendered completely defenseless and would have no choice but to run away, especially on the Great Plateau on Master Mode. I think this is meant to encourage us to be prepared and to not engage in combat unless it is absolutely necessary. However, that being said, there are times when enemies manage to surprise or otherwise corner Link, right? For instances like this, it would be useful if Link possessed some basic ability to defend himself while unarmed, you know, kind of like in the thumbnail, boxing, or having fists to use against enemies. Obviously, an unarmed strike should do less damage than even the weakest weapon, but it should only be used as an absolute last resort. Still, adding such a feature into the sequel would be incredibly useful for us as players going into Tears of the Kingdom. It'd be pretty cool. And since we're on the topic of combat in the Legend of Zelda series, there's actually something that we talked about in this video that I went into way more depth on in this video here. And in that video, I talk more about the enemies that I personally would like to see return in Tears of the Kingdom. So, Zelda crew, make sure you click on the screen here, because who knows, man, you just might agree with me. Or not, which is totally fine too. Much love, Zelda crew. Be the light. Let's hop on over to this Zelda video now.